Yeah, hi everyone. Well, as Lynn was saying there, I think it's fascinating listening to your paper, Margaret, and I think there are some of the themes which I prepared for this talk which definitely fall into that stream. I think we draw from different sources, in places, but we definitely there's definitely a number of overlapping themes. So Lynn had asked me to Lynn and Richard asked me to put together a short paper based on some of the work that I've been doing over the years around the notion of the self and the way that dementia studies tends to approach thinking about the self. I've tried to pitch this more as a series of provocations, questions and provocations, rather than a formal paper per se. But I've entitled this Composting the Self, Dementia, Critical Posthumanism and the Fifth Movement. I should emphasise that notion of compost or composting is not mine. That comes from Donna Haraway, which you mentioned there, Marguerite, and particularly some of her later work, 2015, 2016, where she consciously described herself as a compostist as opposed to a posthumanist, which I found quite an interesting metaphor. And I think that's something that's very, very useful when it comes to thinking about dementia and the self in dementia. So I prepared really this talk around a series of three particular provocations, which I'll try and go through and elaborate in turn. But what I'm hoping to do really is not give any kind of definitive statement about a posthumanist perspective in dementia. I feel uniquely unqualified to offer that. But what I am hoping to do, I think, is to present a series of concepts or a way of thinking that offers us an alternative way of thinking about living and dying well with dementia in an increasingly damaged Earth, increasingly damaged planet. So I wanted to start with this first provocation, really about questioning or thinking about the way dementia studies has tended to think of itself and its understanding of the self in dementia. And really trying to, as a challenge really, I think, to a tendency that exists within dementia studies, I think, to think in it, to understand its evolution of thinking about self in dementia in a very modernist, very linear notion of progress. That as we progress through the centuries in dementia studies, we are arriving at ever more enlightened, ever more socially and intellectually progressive understandings of the self. And I do find sometimes that I think dementia studies I think there's a limitation in some of its historical analysis, and so that's something which I've very much been trying to develop some insight into. So I mean, I could probably spend the next 15 minutes going through this, I won't. But I think, but just to chart really, I find it very interesting charting some of the way in which the self has evolved, in dementia studies, and it's often portrayed as thinking along these lines. So we go back to some of the early mentions of dementia in late 18th century, early 19th century psychiatry, particularly from the perspective of the moral treatment movement, by Philippe Pinel, drawing very much on a John Locke-inspired notion of the self as reason and consciousness, and the idea of dementia as the corruption and distortion of that reasoning self, but not its complete removal. So, as a result of it, that Lockean self is still in there in dementia. It's corrupted, not absent. Ergo, people with dementia are entitled to humane forms of treatment. So you see some of the reforms of the asylum movements in there, particularly removal of treatments like purging and blistering in favour of more humane treatments. But then he said to talk about this second movement, this rise of biomedicine in dementia studies, which takes the materialising of the self, putting the self and dementia into the brain as opposed to the mind. So I think you particularly hear in the rise of people like Alzheimer, Pick, Louis, and thinking about dementia, but an attempt to try and bring dementia and the self into the realm of matter as opposed to cognition, but also in a curious way returning to some of the earlier forms of moral treatment in terms of the idea of a self that's besieged by an incomer, by an illness, a disease. Right. But as we've become more enlightened and more progressive, we begin to see to the late 1990s, late 20th century, with the rise of the personhood movement, and particularly some of the vehement attacks on some of these earlier traditions by people like Tom Kipling, Stephen Sabat, as the idea of these promoting a form of social death you know, the death of the self that leaves an otherwise healthy body behind, and an emphasis on personhood as a relational entity, relational selves, and an influence very much the kind of social psychology of it. And then moving to where we are now in terms of thinking about the self in dementia as a political animal as well, and a collective animal, as well as a social one. So this is a kind of narrative which you tend to see, I think, particularly within more applied settings in dementia studies. I tend to see it in a kind of a different way to that. I think, Marguerite, you mentioned the Deleuzian notion of assemblage. I think the Deleuzian notion of a rhizome is also a very useful way of charting dementia, the way that dementia studies has tended to approach the self, which is not as these distinct, discrete paradigms as is somehow thought of, you know, sometimes presented as reaching to ever more enlightened perspectives, but a much more twisted, tentacular knotting of different perspectives that often expand and contract as a result of what people like Derrida or Nicholas Jenkins would describe as that sort of semantic overburdening. You know, the concepts become too tense to incorporate experience within them, they break open again and expand and grow. But I don't see these as terribly distinct, progressive linear movements. So, for example, you know, we tend to talk a lot about human rights in dementia now. The first reference I found to human rights in dementia was 1794, Felipe Pinel, in his memoir on madness, addressed to the Natural History Society. Now, arguably, advocating the human rights of the insane, including people with dementia at that time, was far more radical in the context of the French Revolution than it is today. Similarly, if we look at some of the texts around moral treatment, particularly the approach to moral treatment that was advocated within the retreat and the various asylums in northern England, you see really strong overlaps here in the notion of the moral self that endures, the inner light, you know, that endures despite the ravage of disease of cognition. Again, moral treatment is still very much anchored in a Lockean approach to the self. Which to me, I see that thread resurge then when it comes to Kitwood speaking about these sort of inner light, you know, inner presence. It comes back again. There are these. So I think what we see in these different movements over this period of time, in this complex tentacular knotting, are these same themes of liberal humanism reappearing in different guises, in different formations, in different presentations, different registers, but they are not these distinct paradigms as sometimes I think a more modernist view of dementia studies would sometimes lead us into thinking. So it brings, so I think from that point of positioning, my questioning comes from, you know, what's over here? And that's where I think my understanding or my take on posthumanism in dementia comes from, is not something that sits at the other end of that linear trajectory, that we move beyond human rights-based approaches or, you know, in its later discourses into thinking about posthumanism. I think that's to repeat and fall into that modernist trap. What I suppose question or wondering, is there this element of this rhizome that's existing before, during, after those more those enlightenment-based and liberal humanist expressions, that is still entangled in humanist thinking, but is nonetheless questioning and critiquing of these notions of human exceptionalism, bounded individualism that Marguerite was discussing so eloquently there. So that's what I've become increasingly interested in over the last few years, is kind of what's in this space. So what I've tried to represent here is what I've started thinking about more is the layers of compost. You know, anyone who's done any gardening will know that, you know, if you want to make good compost, you have layers of different things that mulch into each other. They rot and they twist and they become something through their decomposition. They start to create something that then something fertile grows out of. So I think these are really useful metaphors, actually, when combining notions of ideas of living and dying to thinking about self and dementia in quite different ways. So I've tried to represent these here as these kind of layers of compost and different concepts that I'm working with at the moment, particularly as I like to think of these kind of concepts as worms in this compost. You know, they burrow, they ingest, they digest, they excrete. You know, they mingle and merge their matter into each other, and something rich comes out of that compost. So the ones I've highlighted in yellow, I suppose, are the ones that I want to briefly talk about here. But it was fascinating, Margaret, when you were talking about some of the advances in bioscience, as critiquing some of these enlightenment-based perspectives. I completely agree. I also think that there's a huge amount of work completely outside that Western tradition that has said very similar things, and actually science is catching up with some of those understandings. So I think it's important to acknowledge those bodies of work, and some of these ideas, particularly as I'm going to talk about the notion of not self. This is something, you know, that the notion of interbeing, particularly as advocated by Buddhists such as Thich Nhat Hanh, offer us some very, very interesting and exciting ways of thinking about subjectivity and dementia in all the ways that you're speaking to there, Marguerite, about impermanence and the sidestepping of the insult of death. So I'll talk a little bit about those. But there's also some concepts I think I've been working with recently from broadly what I've been describing as science and technology studies, although it's much more complicated than that. But particularly notions such as sympoiesis, and maybe as an alternative to prosthesis, you know, an augmentation. But you know, maybe that's a discussion point maybe there. But also some other notions of Gaia, you know, thinking of complex systems that incorporate humans but are much more than human. Argential realism, and I guess with some of Barad, which I know is kind of influenced there. But I've also, and this is where I start to feel a little bit more jittery on myself, started branching into some of the areas, concepts around animal studies, critical animal studies, particularly notions of speciesism. And I'll try and link that to some of the things you were talking about as well, Marguerite, to go through this. But I'll start with you know, thinking this provocation of thinking about dementia as an aspect of the not self characteristic. I don't know if anyone come across this concept of not self. No. So, I mean, I would say actually, if you look, probably one of the first radical challenges to Western European Enlightenment notions of the unified self that you were critiquing there, Marguerite, you can find at least 2,000 years before the European Enlightenment in the expressions such as this one. This is from a Buddhist text called the Anattalikana Sutta, or the Discourse of Not Self. And in this, a very short text actually, very short text, and a bit of it's been translated from the Pali Canon here. But in this, I mean, Siddhartha Gautama is effectively a description of Siddhartha Gautama's critique of the illusion, phenomenological illusion of perception, of the self. That really is taking a series of qualities that in our phenomenological experience we take to be ourselves. So consciousness, he moves to say consciousness is not self. Feeling is not self. Memory is not self. He takes each of these notions that we consider on our lived experience basis to be ourselves, and tries to highlight that these are not what we think they are. They are not ourselves. And be based on the assumption, well, if they were ourselves, we could control them. The very fact that they are beyond our ability to control speaks to the notion that they are not the unified self. There is no singular self in the brain, pulling the levers, coordinating everything. So you see this quote come up again and again. This is not mine, this is not I, this is not myself. And I think this is a fascinating text, actually. I think it provided a basis for a whole body of philosophical work within the Buddhist canon. But also what I find very fascinating is now contemporary studies in evolutionary psychology, neuroscience are coming to this. So if you look at particular as popularizations of these sort of things like Robert Wright's Why Buddhism is True, or Bruce Hood's The Illusion of the Self, Paul Gilbert's The Compassionate Mind, these are all drawing on contemporary studies within neuroscience and evolutionary psychology as a means of coming to the same conclusion. There is no self, there is no single unified self in the brain that is the point of control. It's an experience of, it's an epiphenomenon of our experience. It's the result of, you know, interesting new concepts in these things like the default mode network, you know, the modular theory of mind. You know, these are tradition, canons within neuroscience and evolutionary psychology that is coming to the very same conclusions. That what we perceive and experience as ourselves is not there. And this is so it's coming at it from a different angle. It's coming at it actually from a different angle, but I find it extremely useful on two counts. One, I think, as a way of trying to step out of some of our over-reliance, I think, on Western philosophy. Because often, when we're talking about the self, this has a history going back to at least Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic tradition within European thought. Religious notions are heavily imbued in these. So, I think actually drawing on a different philosophical discourse actually helps to illuminate that. But also, I think that's a fascinating question when we bring it to dementia. What does it mean when you start asking that question of dementia? If you were to substitute consciousness for dementia there and repeat that text, dementia is not self. When we think about some of the aspects of dementia, this is not mine, this is not I, this is not myself. I think these are some, I don't have answers to this, by the way, these are, hence why I put this as provocation. But I think it's a useful way. We get so, as you described there, Marguerite, I think so intent on this idea of bending and remoulding a concept of the self in order to make it more adaptable to the people that we wish to include, then maybe we actually need to start expanding our scope a little bit bigger than that. So, well, what about not self? What about, and I think this ties in and builds, as I said, notions of interbeing, the connectedness. Again, Buddhist philosophy tends not to have drawn these individual distinctions between self and other. So, Thich Nhat Hanh, for example, in The Art of Living, provides a really eloquent discussion of the ontological position of interbeing, and of how it is impossible to separate the agency of one actor from another, to a thing, to a person. So I suppose moving on to that third provocation, I've talked a little bit about a provocation of challenging that linear notion of dementia studies and how it thinks of the self as reaching ever more progressive and enlightened understandings. And a provocation of what might be more useful when we think of not self as opposed to self in dementia. But I want to finish with maybe a slightly more tricksy one to offer, which is this notion of speciesism in dementia. Now I find it very interesting that across critical studies there are a number of areas that are returning to this notion of speciesism and its connection to other forms of oppression and discrimination. So I think if you see the radical social work, I think of Thomas Ryan, for example, in that perspective, John Sorensen in sociology. You've got, losing my notes here. Yeah, so you've got Richard Gorman, for example, in the field of critical geography, and Mary Fantasque in the field of disability studies, drawing these complex parallels between how we think of species and speciesism and its connections to other forms of discrimination and oppression. So, just to be clear here, I suppose I'm not. This is not a positioning of people with dementia in terms of a moral status to animals, or some of the things which have been very controversial within things like Peter Singer's text. I'm not going there at all. But what I do think is that there is an opportunity for dementia studies in terms of that critical perspective to connect with some of these other bodies of critical scholarship that is exploring the intersections between speciesism, racism, sexism, and ableism. Whereas, and I've included this quote for a definition of one definition of speciesism here with Ryder, 1975. It's discrimination against certain animals based on the assumption of human superiority. Now, I think there's no doubt that throughout the centuries, people with dementia have been animalized, treated as beasts, as something to be seen or spectacles in the zoo.